March 17, 1943. 11:47 a.m. Mediterranean Sea, 40 miles off the Tunisian coast. Lance Wade has exactly 4 seconds to live. 2 German Messerschmitt 109s are diving at him from 20,000 feet. Their pilots are Luftwaffe veterans with over 30 kills between them. They have altitude. They have speed. They have every advantage that matters. Wade has nothing. His wingman just broke left and vanished. His P-40 Warhawk is slow-low and completely alone. The German in front has already opened fire. Tracer rounds are streaking toward his cockpit. Every rule of aerial combat says he should dive, build speed, try to run. Every instinct in his body screams the same thing. Lance Wade pulls back on the stick instead, hard. What happens next will save the lives of over 200 Allied pilots before the year ends. It will reduce American fighter losses in the Mediterranean by 18%. It will force the Luftwaffe to completely rewrite their attack protocols, but right now in this moment, it looks like suicide. This is the story of how a small-town Texan with bad eyesight and no connections discovered something that the greatest military minds of 3 nations had missed. And how that discovery changed the air war forever. To understand what Wade did, you need to understand how badly the Allies were losing in early 1943. The Mediterranean theater was bleeding pilots at a rate that bordered on catastrophic. American P-40 squadrons were experiencing 50% casualties every 8 weeks. Let that sink in. Every 2 months, half the pilots in a unit were dead or missing. New replacements arrived from training bases in Arizona and California. Kids mostly. 20 years old, eager, confident. They had hundreds of flight hours in their logbooks. They knew how to handle their aircraft. They had practiced dogfighting against instructors who pulled their punches. None of that mattered. A replacement pilot's average survival time in the Mediterranean was 11 missions. 11. The veterans stopped learning names. They stopped going to memorial services. What was the point? There would be another one tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. The problem was simple and brutal. The P-40 Warhawk was outclassed. Against the German Messerschmitt 109. It was slower by 40 miles per hour. It climbed worse. Its service ceiling was lower. In the vertical fight that defined modern air combat, American pilots were flying coffins. The Germans knew it. They exploited it with surgical precision. Their favorite tactic was the bounce. A pair of Messerschmitts would climb to extreme altitude, 25,000 feet or higher, where P-40s could barely operate. They would wait. Watch. When they spotted Americans below, they dove. 400 miles per hour. Closing distance measured in heartbeats. They swept through formations like scythes through wheat. By the time survivors reacted, the Germans were already climbing away, untouchable, preparing for another pass. Allied doctrine was clear. Maintain speed at all costs. Never turn with the enemy. Use slashing attacks. Fight in pairs. Disengage when outnumbered. These rules were written in blood. They had been refined through 3 years of war over Europe. They worked. When pilots followed them, survival rates improved. When pilots deviated, they died. But here was the terrible truth nobody wanted to say out loud. The rules assumed you could choose when to fight. American pilots in the Mediterranean could not choose. They flew escort missions, bombers, transports, reconnaissance aircraft. They could not run. They could not disengage. When the Germans bounced them, they had to stand and take it. Most died trying. Ground crews worked through the night, patching holes, replacing canopies, scrubbing blood from seats. Mechanics developed superstitions. Some refused to touch aircraft that had lost multiple pilots. Others scratched small symbols on engine cowlings, prayers in grease pencil. Nobody acknowledged them. Nobody had to. Intelligence officers compiled statistics. Commanders sent cables requesting better aircraft. The replies were sympathetic and useless. Everyone was short of everything. The Mediterranean was a secondary theater. Pilots made do with what they had, and they kept dying, 50% every 2 months. The math was unsustainable. Something had to change. Nobody knew what. Nobody except a quiet Texan who spent his nights filling notebooks with calculations that his commanders thought were a waste of time. Lance Carroll Wade was born in 1915 in Broadus, Texas. Population almost nothing. His father was a farmer. His mother died when he was young. There was no money, no connections, no path to anywhere. But there was an airstrip 20 miles outside town, and Wade discovered it when he was 15. He started showing up every day, watching, asking questions. Eventually, the owner let him trade labor for lessons. Wade was not a natural pilot. He did not have the instinctive feel that some men are born with. What he had was something else: patience, precision, an obsessive need to understand why things worked, not just how. He kept notebooks. Every flight he recorded conditions: wind speed, temperature, fuel load, aircraft weight. He noted how each variable changed performance. He calculated margins. He tested limits. By the time he was 18, he understood his aircraft better than pilots with 10 times his experience. When war broke out in Europe, Wade tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps. Rejected. His eyesight was poor. Correctable with glasses, but the standards were strict. He tried again. Rejected again. Most men would have given up. Wade heard about a British program recruiting American volunteers. The Royal Air Force was desperate. They would take almost anyone who could fly. Wade signed up immediately. By late 1940, he was on a ship to England. The RAF sent him to North Africa in early 1942. He flew Hurricanes first, then P-40s, when American aircraft arrived. His squadron was a mix of nationalities: British, South African, Australian, American. They called themselves the Desert Air Force. They were exhausted, outnumbered, constantly losing friends. Wade did not stand out. He was quiet in the mess tent. He did not tell war stories or brag about kills. After missions, he disappeared to his tent. Other pilots thought he was writing letters home. He was not. He was sketching. Diagrams, arcs, vectors. He was trying to solve a problem that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. He was trying to understand the physics of air combat. Most pilots thought in maneuvers: brake left, split S. Chandelle. Wade thought in energy. Potential energy stored as altitude. Kinetic energy expressed as speed. The constant exchange between them. The cost of every turn measured in velocity lost. He began to see patterns, and he noticed something strange about his P-40. Yes, it was slower than a Messerschmitt. Yes, it climbed worse. But at certain speeds in a sustained turn, something interesting happened. The P-40 could actually turn tighter than the German fighter. Lower wing loading, better low-speed handling. In a flat grinding turn, it could outturn the Messerschmitt by a significant margin. This should not matter. Doctrine said, never turn with the enemy. Turning bled speed. Slow aircraft died. Every manual said so. Every instructor taught it. Every after-action report confirmed it. But Wade could not stop thinking. What if everyone was wrong? What if the one place the P-40 had an advantage was exactly the place nobody was looking? He spent weeks working through the mathematics. He sketched maneuvers. He calculated G-forces, stall speeds, turning radii. Gradually an idea took shape. Not a gentle defensive brake, something violent. A full deflection pull at maximum G-load, deliberately sacrificing speed to tighten the turning radius. The goal was not to escape. The goal was to make the attacker overshoot. Turn inside his arc. Reverse the geometry. Make the hunter become the hunted. It required perfect timing. Too early, and the attacker could adjust. Too late, and you were dead. It required taking the aircraft to the absolute edge of a stall. It required ignoring every instinct that screamed to run. It was the opposite of doctrine. It was insane. Wade went to his squadron leader, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, by the book, respected. Wade explained his theory: energy states, turning radius, geometric advantage. The squadron leader listened with visible impatience. His response was blunt. Doctrine exists for a reason. Pilots who deviate die. The discussion was over. Wade was ordered to follow standard procedures. He saluted. He left. He said nothing more. But he did not stop thinking. He could not test the maneuver in training. No friendly pilot would press a mock attack close enough. The margins were too thin, too dangerous. The only way to know if his theory worked was to try it against an actual enemy. If he was wrong, he would not get a second chance. For weeks, Wade flew standard missions. He followed the rules. He survived. He waited. March 17, 1943. Escort mission over the Mediterranean. 4 P-40s protecting a transport aircraft. Routine. Boring. Then the call came. Bandits high. 2 o'clock. Diving. Wade looked up and saw them. 2 Messerschmitts. Classic bounce. Perfect execution. His wingman broke left. The other 2 P-40s scattered. Wade was alone. The Germans split. 1 high, 1 low. Vertical pincer. Textbook trap. No escape. Wade's hand tightened on the stick. His mouth went dry. Fear was there, cold and electric in his chest. But underneath the fear was something else. Calculation. The lead Messerschmitt opened fire. Tracers arced toward him, bright and lazy-looking, deceptively slow. He had 2 seconds, maybe less. Training said, dive. Instinct said dive. Every fiber of his body wanted to push that stick forward and run. Wade pulled back instead. Full elevator. The stick came into his lap. The nose pitched up violently. G-forces slammed him into his seat. Blood drained from his head. His vision collapsed to a gray tunnel. The engine screamed. The wings flexed. The aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. And the Messerschmitt, committed to its dive, unable to match that impossible turn, flashed past so close, Wade saw the pilot's face. Overshoot. Wade rolled out. Slow, vulnerable, but alive. The second Messerschmitt was still coming. Wade did not hesitate. Same pull, same violence, same gray out, same shuddering edge of stall. Same result. Both Germans were now ahead of him. They climbed away, confused, unwilling to dive again into whatever trap this American had set. Wade turned back toward the transport. His hands were shaking. His heart was slamming against his ribs. He had just done something that should have killed him. It worked. He landed in silence. His ground crew found no damage, no bullet holes. Wade climbed out on unsteady legs. He walked to his tent. He sat on his cot. He opened his notebook. He sketched the engagement from memory. Every angle. Every second. At the bottom of the page he wrote a single word. Repeatable. His squadron leader did not see it that way. He called Wade in. Demanded an explanation. Told him he got lucky. Ordered him never to try that maneuver again. Doctrine exists for a reason. Wade listened. Saluted. Left. He knew what he had experienced. It was not luck. It was physics. But he could not convince anyone with words. He needed proof. He needed repetition. He needed other pilots to see it work. So he kept flying. And he kept waiting for the next bounce. It came 3 weeks later. This time Wade was ready. The moment the Messerschmitt committed, he pulled. Same violent turn, same edge of stall, same overshoot. But this time, Wade had enough energy left to reverse. He pulled into a climbing turn, tracking the German as it tried to escape. He fired. His tracers converged. The Messerschmitt trailed smoke and dove for the deck. Wade did not follow. He turned back to formation. Another engagement. Another survival. 2 weeks after that, A third bounce. This time Wade's wingman saw the maneuver. After they landed, the wingman asked how he did it. Wade explained. Slowly. Carefully. He drew diagrams in the sand. Timing. Speed. The exact moment to initiate the pull. The wingman listened. Next mission, when they were attacked, the wingman tried it. He pulled too early the first time. Overshot his own maneuver, but he survived. Second engagement, he got the timing right. He forced an overshoot. He lived. Word began to spread. Other pilots asked questions. Wade started giving informal briefings, sketches on scrap paper, hand demonstrations. Some pilots were skeptical. Others were desperate enough to try anything. The squadron leader heard about it. He was furious. He called Wade in again, threatened to ground him. Wade listened calmly. Then he asked one question. How many pilots have survived using this maneuver? The leader had no answer. Wade did. 7 pilots, 8 engagements, 0 losses. The numbers spoke. The leader dismissed him without another word. He did not issue the grounding order. By June 1943, the maneuver had spread through 3 squadrons. Pilots called it Wade's turn. Some called it the last-ditch break. A few called it suicide with a chance. Then came the engagement that changed everything. June 14, 1943. A German fighter group bounced an entire Allied formation. 12 P-40s against 20 Messerschmitts. The sky turned into chaos. Tracers everywhere, smoke, screaming engines. Wade pulled his maneuver twice. Other pilots did the same. The Luftwaffe, expecting easy kills, suddenly faced targets that refused to cooperate. Attacks that should have succeeded failed. Firing solutions that should have been simple evaporated. When it was over, 3 P-40s were lost. 9 returned. In previous engagements of similar size, losses averaged 50%. This time, 75% survived. The math was undeniable. Something had changed, but this was only the beginning. In Part 2, we will see what happened when word of Wade's discovery reached higher command. We will see the secret tests, the skeptical instructors, the formal evaluation that nearly killed the program before it started. We will see the moment when one captured German pilot revealed just how much the Luftwaffe feared this new American tactic. And we will see the price that Lance Wade himself would pay for his discovery. A price measured not in medals or recognition, but in the quiet tragedy that awaits all men who see too clearly in a world that prefers to stay blind. The question is no longer whether the maneuver works. Wade has proven that beyond doubt. The question is whether it can spread fast enough to matter, whether enough pilots can learn it before the Germans adapt, and whether one small-town Texan's calculations can truly change the trajectory of the war itself. The answer will surprise you. And it begins with a flight instructor who walked away from Wade's demonstration, white-faced and shaking, convinced he had just witnessed something that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat forever. 7 pilots, 8 engagements, 0 losses. Those were the numbers Lance Wade presented to his squadron leader in June 1943. Numbers that should have ended the debate. Numbers that proved his forbidden maneuver worked. But Wade was about to learn something that every innovator in military history has learned the hard way. Proving you are right is easy. Convincing people who have built their careers on the opposite belief is nearly impossible. Within 72 hours of that June 14th engagement, word of Wade's turn had reached Allied Air Command in North Africa. A report landed on the desk of Group Captain Harold Morrison, Chief Tactical Officer for the Mediterranean Theater. Morrison was a decorated veteran. Battle of Britain, Malta, 3 years of air combat. He had written the doctrine that Wade was violating. He had buried friends who died because they ignored that doctrine. And now some small-town American was telling him everything he knew was wrong. Morrison's response was immediate. He ordered Wade grounded pending investigation. The charge was reckless endangerment of fellow pilots. The penalty could be court-martial. And this is where everything nearly fell apart. Group Captain Morrison was not a villain. He was a professional who had seen too many young pilots die from overconfidence. He had watched men ignore doctrine and pay with their lives. In his experience, miracle tactics were usually fantasies that got people killed. Wade's report read like exactly that kind of fantasy. A maneuver that deliberately sacrificed speed. A turn that took the aircraft to the edge of stall. A tactic that required ignoring every survival instinct. Morrison had heard similar claims before, from pilots who were lucky once and dead the next mission. He summoned Wade to his office on June 18th. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Morrison spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Flight Lieutenant Wade, I have read your combat reports. I have spoken with your squadron leader. I have reviewed the accounts from pilots who claim to have witnessed your maneuver. Do you understand the position you have put me in?" Wade stood at attention. "Sir, the results speak for themselves." "Results?" Morrison leaned forward. 7 pilots, 8 engagements. That is what you call results. Do you know how many pilots I have lost in this theater? 437? In 18 months. Do you know how many of them died, trying unorthodox tactics they were certain would work? Wade said nothing. Doctrine exists because it has been tested. Not in 8 engagements, in thousands. Across 3 years of war. By pilots far more experienced than you. When you encourage men to ignore that doctrine, you are not saving lives. You are gambling with them. With respect, sir, the doctrine assumes we can choose when to engage. We cannot. Escort missions force us to stand and fight. The current survival rate for bounce scenarios is below 40%. My maneuver has achieved 100% survival in documented cases. Morrison's expression hardened. Documented by whom? By you. By pilots who want to believe they have found a magic solution. By pilots who are still alive, sir. The room went silent. Morrison stared at Wade for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, colder. You are grounded effective immediately. You will not fly. You will not train other pilots. You will not discuss this maneuver with anyone. If I hear that you have violated these orders, I will have you court-martialed and sent home in disgrace. Do you understand? Wade understood. He saluted. He left. He had just lost everything. But Wade had made an impression on someone else in that room. Squadron leader James Stockwell had been standing in the corner during the entire meeting. Stockwell was Morrison's aide, a former test pilot, a man who had spent years evaluating aircraft performance at the edge of their envelopes. He had listened to Wade's explanation of energy states and turning radius. He had heard something that Morrison missed. He heard mathematics. That night, Stockwell visited Wade's tent. He came alone, unofficial. He asked Wade to explain the maneuver again. Not the combat application. The physics. Wade talked for 2 hours. He showed his notebooks, the calculations, the diagrams, the analysis of wing loading and G-tolerance and stall characteristics. Stockwell listened without interrupting. When Wade finished, Stockwell asked one question. Can you demonstrate this in a controlled environment? Not combat. A test flight where we can measure everything. Wade could, but he was grounded. Stockwell smiled. Leave Morrison to me. I need 3 days. Stockwell spent those 3 days doing something dangerous. He went over Morrison's head. He contacted Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of all Allied air forces in the Mediterranean. Park was a legend. He had commanded 11 Group during the Battle of Britain. He had saved Malta from surrender. He was also known for one thing that set him apart from other senior officers. He listened to pilots. Stockwell's report reached Park on June 21st. It included Wade's mathematics. It included the survival statistics. It included a request for one official test flight with proper instrumentation and observers. Park approved it within 6 hours. Morrison was furious. But he could not countermand an Air Vice Marshal. The test was scheduled for June 28th. Wade had exactly one chance to prove everything. June 28, 1943. RAF, Lucca, Malta. 600 hours. The morning was clear. Visibility unlimited. Perfect conditions for what was about to happen. Wade arrived at the flight line to find an audience he had not expected. Air Vice Marshal Park himself had flown in from Cairo. Group Captain Morrison stood beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. 16 other officers formed a semicircle near the runway. Engineers, tacticians, flight instructors, men who would decide if Wade's maneuver lived or died. 2 aircraft sat on the tarmac. Wade's P-40 Warhawk and a Spitfire Mark 9 piloted by squadron leader Dennis Mitchell, one of the RAF's most experienced aggressor pilots. Mitchell's job was simple: attack Wade exactly as a German would. Full speed, full commitment, no pulled punches. If Wade's maneuver failed, Mitchell would be close enough to kill him in actual combat. The test parameters were precise. Mitchell would climb to 15,000 feet. Wade would orbit at 8,000. Mitchell would execute a standard Luftwaffe bounce. Wade would attempt his defensive break. Cameras mounted on both aircraft would record everything. A chase plane would observe from a safe distance. Wade climbed into his cockpit. His hands were steady. His mind was quiet. He had done this in combat. He knew it worked, but combat was chaos. This was a fishbowl. Every error would be visible. Every mistake would be analyzed. If he failed here, the maneuver would be officially declared dangerous. No pilot would ever be allowed to use it again. Wade taxied to the runway. He took off. He climbed to 8,000 feet and began his orbit. The radio crackled. Mitchell was beginning his attack run. Wade looked up. He could not see the Spitfire yet. It was too high, too far. But it was coming. 30 seconds passed. 45. Then Wade saw him. A dot against the blue, growing fast. Mitchell was diving at over 380 miles per hour. Committed. Aggressive. Exactly like a German. Wade watched the dot become an aircraft. He watched the Spitfire's nose, waiting for the moment when Mitchell would open fire, if this were real combat. The moment when Wade would have less than 2 seconds to react. Now. Wade pulled. Full elevator. The stick came into his lap. The G-forces hit him like a hammer. 4 Gs, 5. His vision narrowed. The aircraft shuddered. The engine screamed. He felt the buffet of approaching stall. He held it, pushed through the gray at the edges of his sight, trusted the mathematics. The Spitfire flashed past. Below him. Behind him. Mitchell had overshot by nearly 300 feet. Wade rolled out. Slow, low, but in perfect position to reverse if this were actual combat. On the ground, no one spoke. Park watched through binoculars. Morrison's arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides. Stockwell was grinning. The radio crackled. Mitchell's voice. "Bloody hell. He just vanished. I had him dead center, and then he was gone." They ran the test 4 more times. Each time, Mitchell adjusted his approach. Faster, steeper, different angles. Each time Wade executed the break. Each time Mitchell overshot. On the 5th run, Wade added something new. After forcing the overshoot, he reversed hard and pulled into a tracking position behind Mitchell. If he had weapons hot, it would have been a kill. The chase plane cameras captured everything. The engineers measured the turning radii. Wade's P-40 had achieved a sustained turn rate that the manual said was impossible. He had operated at 5.2 Gs for nearly 8 seconds. He had maintained control at an airspeed of just 142 miles per hour, 18 miles per hour above stall. The margin was insane. The results were undeniable. Park descended from the observation platform. He walked directly to Wade's aircraft. Wade climbed out and saluted. Park returned it. "Flight Lieutenant, how long have you known about this?" "Since March, sir. I have been trying to get someone to listen since April." Park glanced at Morrison. Morrison said nothing. "As of this moment," Park said, "you are no longer grounded. You are reassigned to my tactical development staff. Your job is to teach this maneuver to every P-40 pilot in the Mediterranean. Starting tomorrow. Wade blinked. Sir, the doctrine. The doctrine, Park interrupted, exists to keep pilots alive. If your maneuver does that better, then the doctrine changes. That is how we win wars, Flight Lieutenant. Not by worshipping the past, by adapting to the present. Wade saluted again. This time he meant it. The next 3 months were the hardest of Wade's life. Teaching the maneuver in a briefing room was simple. Teaching it to pilots who had been trained their entire careers to do the opposite was something else entirely. Wade traveled to 14 squadrons across North Africa and Sicily. He gave demonstrations. He flew training missions. He sat with pilots who had lost wingmen and explained why everything they had been taught was incomplete. Some listened, some did not. The resistance was fierce. Veteran pilots accused Wade of getting men killed with a trick that worked in tests but would fail in combat. Squadron leaders resented an outsider telling them how to fight. Flight instructors demanded to know why their training was suddenly wrong. Wade answered every question. He showed the data. He flew with skeptics and demonstrated the maneuver until they believed. Slowly, pilot by pilot, squadron by squadron, the tide turned. By September 1943, Wade's turn was standard training for all P-40 units in the Mediterranean. The results were immediate. Loss rates in bounce scenarios dropped from 60% to 34%. Pilots who had expected to die found themselves surviving. Pilots who survived started winning. The Luftwaffe noticed. Captured German pilots reported confusion about American tactics. Attacks that should have succeeded were failing. Firing solutions that should have been simple were evaporating. For the first time since the air war began, German pilots were hesitating before committing to attacks on P-40s. That hesitation cost them speed, cost them position, cost them kills. But success created a new problem. A problem that Wade had not anticipated. A problem that would nearly destroy everything he had built. By October 1943, intelligence reports confirmed that the Luftwaffe had obtained detailed information about Wade's maneuver. A captured American pilot had been interrogated. Under pressure, he had described the technique. German tacticians were already developing countermeasures. They were training their pilots to recognize the break and adjust their attacks. They were creating new approach angles designed to make the maneuver impossible. Wade had given the Allies an edge. Now the Germans were working to take it away. And they had something Wade did not: time, resources, the institutional support of an air force that adapted faster than any in the world. In Part 3, we will see the German response. We will see the new tactics they developed. We will see the moment when Wade realized his maneuver was no longer enough. And we will see the desperate gamble he made to stay one step ahead. A gamble that would cost him more than he ever imagined. The war for the Mediterranean skies was not over. It was just entering its most dangerous phase. And Lance Wade was about to discover that being right is not the same as winning. The real battle was only beginning. A small-town Texan with bad eyesight invented a maneuver that everyone said was suicide. He proved them wrong. He convinced the brass. He trained hundreds of pilots. By September 1943, Wade's turn had reduced Allied fighter losses in the Mediterranean by 26%. P-40 pilots who had expected to die were surviving. Pilots who survived were winning. For the first time since the air war began, the Luftwaffe was hesitating. But the Germans did not build the most effective air force in history by accepting defeat. In October 1943, intelligence confirmed what Wade had feared. A captured American pilot had broken under interrogation. He had described the maneuver in detail. German tacticians were already developing countermeasures. They were training their pilots to recognize Wade's turn and defeat it. The edge that had taken 6 months to build was about to disappear. And this time, the enemy knew exactly what they were hunting. The Luftwaffe response was swift and systematic. Within 3 weeks of obtaining the intelligence, German training units across the Mediterranean had received new tactical bulletins. The documents were precise. They described the American defensive break in technical detail: turning radius, speed range, G-load tolerance, entry timing. The Germans understood the physics as well as Wade did. They understood something else too. The maneuver had a weakness. Wade's turn worked because it forced an overshoot. The attacker committed to a diving pass. The defender pulled into a violent turn, and the attacker's momentum carried him past the target. But what if the attacker did not commit? What if he pulled out early? What if he maintained altitude and set up for a second pass instead of pressing the first attack? The German solution was elegant. They called it the delayed pursuit. Instead of diving all the way to firing range, Luftwaffe pilots were trained to break off at 2,000 feet above the target. They would watch. If the American began Wade's turn, the German would climb away and reset. If the American did not turn, the German would continue the attack. Either way, the American lost. Turn early and waste energy. Turn late and die. The mathematics had shifted. By November 1943, the results were visible. Allied loss rates, which had dropped to 34% in bounce scenarios, began climbing again. 38%, 41%, 44%. Pilots reported that German attacks felt different, more cautious, more patient. The wild, aggressive bounces of the summer had been replaced by calculated stalking. Wade analyzed the combat reports. He saw the pattern immediately. The Germans were not trying to defeat his maneuver. They were trying to make it irrelevant. They were changing the rules of engagement entirely. And they were succeeding. Group Captain Morrison, who had opposed Wade from the beginning, requested a meeting with Air Vice Marshal Park. His message was blunt. The tactical advantage had been neutralized. Continued emphasis on Wade's turn was now counterproductive. Pilots were relying on a defense that no longer worked. Morrison recommended returning to standard doctrine. Park listened. He did not agree. But he did not disagree either. He gave Wade 30 days to find a solution. If loss rates did not improve, the program would be suspended. Wade had 1 month to reinvent everything. But that was not the only problem he faced. On November 12th, a training accident at RAF Hal Far killed 2 pilots. Flight Lieutenant James Corbett and Pilot Officer William Shaw were practicing Wade's turn under instructor supervision. Corbett initiated the break too late. Shaw, following behind, collided with him during the maneuver. Both aircraft went into the sea. There were no survivors. The investigation was immediate. The findings were damning. Shaw had been in theater for only 3 weeks. He had received 4 hours of instruction on the defensive break. That was standard. It was also, according to the accident board, completely inadequate. Wade's turn required precise timing and aircraft control that took months to develop. Rushing pilots through abbreviated training was putting lives at risk. The report recommended suspending all instruction until a comprehensive training program could be developed. Morrison seized on the findings. He circulated the report to every squadron commander in the theater. His covering memo was carefully worded but unmistakable. Wade's program was killing pilots. The maneuver was too complex for average aviators. The theoretical benefits did not justify the practical risks. Pilots began to doubt. Squadron leaders who had supported Wade grew quiet. The momentum that had taken 6 months to build was collapsing in weeks. Wade requested a meeting with Park. He was denied. The Air Vice Marshal was in Cairo, unavailable. Wade was running out of time, running out of allies, running out of options. Then, on November 29, 1943, everything changed. The target was a German supply convoy moving along the Tunisian coast. 12 transport ships, 8 escort vessels, heavy anti-aircraft coverage. The convoy was carrying fuel and ammunition for Rommel's retreating forces. Destroying it would cripple German operations for weeks. Allied command assigned the mission to the 57th Fighter Group. 16 P-40 Warhawks, escort and ground attack. The pilots knew the stakes. They also knew the risks. German fighters from JG-77 were based less than 50 miles from the convoy route. A response was guaranteed. The 57th would be outnumbered, outperformed, fighting over water with no place to land if damaged. Wade was not supposed to be on the mission. His role was training and tactical development. But the 57th's commander, Colonel Arthur Salisbury, made a request. He wanted Wade flying with them. He wanted his pilots to see the maneuver work in actual combat against German countermeasures. Park approved. Wade climbed into his P-40 at 05:47 hours. The formation took off into a gray Mediterranean dawn. They found the convoy at 06:23. 12 ships spread across 2 miles of ocean. Flak batteries already tracking them. Salisbury split the formation. 8 aircraft for the attack run. 8 for top cover. Wade was assigned to top cover. His job was to keep the Germans off the bombers. The attack began. P-40s dove toward the convoy. Flak exploded around them. Tracers stitched the sky. The first bombs hit a transport ship amidships. Fire erupted. Then the call came. Bandits. High. Coming fast. Wade looked up. He counted 12, 14, 16 Messerschmitts. JG-77 had scrambled everything they had. The Germans did not dive immediately. They circled. Assessed. They were using the new tactics. Delayed pursuit. Waiting for the Americans to commit. Waiting for mistakes. Wade keyed his radio. All top cover. Hold formation. Do not chase. Let them come to us. The P-40s tightened up. 8 aircraft in a defensive weave. The Germans circled higher. 1 minute. 2. The attack aircraft below were making their runs. Ships were burning. But the window was closing. If the fighters did not engage soon, the Germans would catch the P-40s during their climb out. Loaded with ordnance. Slow. Vulnerable. Wade made a decision. He broke formation. Alone. Climbing toward the German fighters. It was insane. 1 P-40 against 16 Messerschmitts. But Wade was not trying to fight. He was trying to provoke. He needed the Germans to commit, to abandon their patience, to attack him instead of waiting for the bombers. It worked. 4 Messerschmitts peeled off and dove. Wade watched them come. He did not turn early. He did not panic. He waited until the lead German was at 1,500 feet. Then 1,000. Then 800. At 600 feet, Wade saw muzzle flashes. He pulled. Not the standard brake. Something new. Something he had been developing for 3 weeks. Instead of a flat turn, Wade rolled inverted and pulled down. A split S variation that added a vertical component. The G-forces were brutal. His vision went black. He held it. Trusted the math. When his sight returned, he was 2,000 feet below his starting altitude. The Germans were above him. All 4 had overshot. But Wade was not done. He had planned for this. He pulled up into a chandelle, converting his dive speed into altitude, curving back toward the fight. The Germans were still trying to reacquire him. They had never seen anyone survive that combination. Wade came out of the chandelle behind the trailing Messerschmitt. He fired. A 2-second burst. The German fighter shuddered. Smoke poured from the engine. It rolled and dove toward the sea. The other 3 Germans scattered. Wade's radio exploded with voices. The remaining top cover had engaged. The Germans, distracted by Wade's attack, had lost their coordination. Dogfights erupted across the sky, but the disciplined, delayed pursuit had collapsed into chaos. P-40s were using Wade's turn. Germans were overshooting. The mathematics had shifted again. Below the last attack, aircraft completed their runs. 5 transports were burning. 2 were sinking. The convoy was devastated. Salisbury called the withdrawal. P-40s dove for the deck and ran for home. The Germans pursued but could not catch them. Wade was the last to disengage. He had 1 more kill, a Messerschmitt that tried to bounce him during the retreat. Wade broke into him. Forced the overshoot. Reversed. Fired. The German went into the sea trailing flames. Final tally. 7 German fighters destroyed. 2 probables. 4 damaged. Allied losses. 2 P-40s. 1 pilot recovered by rescue boat. 1 killed. Against 16 Messerschmitts. With outdated aircraft, using a maneuver that the Germans had supposedly neutralized. The news spread through the Mediterranean theater within 48 hours. Pilots who had doubted Wade's methods heard about the convoy battle. They heard about the new vertical variation. They heard about 7 kills against 2 losses. Suddenly, everyone wanted training. Squadron leaders who had gone quiet started requesting instructors. Morrison's memo about the training accident was forgotten. The numbers were too compelling to ignore. Park summoned Wade to Cairo on December 3rd. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Wade explained the modification, the vertical component, the split S entry that added 3-dimensional complexity. He showed diagrams. He presented the physics. Park listened. When Wade finished, Park made an announcement. Wade was being promoted to squadron leader. He was being given command of a new tactical development unit. His mission was to refine the maneuver and train instructors who would spread it across every Allied fighter squadron in the theater. Wade had won. Not just the battle. The war for acceptance. By February 1944, the modified Wade's turn was standard doctrine for all Allied fighters in the Mediterranean. Loss rates in bounce scenarios dropped to 22%. The lowest since the air war began. German pilots reported increasing frustration. Their tactical bulletins were updated again and again. Each time Wade adapted. Each time the Allies stayed 1 step ahead. The Luftwaffe began avoiding engagement with P-40 formations entirely. They focused on bombers, on transports, on targets that could not fight back. The psychological impact was immense. American pilots flew with confidence they had never possessed. German pilots flew with caution that cost them kills. The air war over the Mediterranean had shifted, not because of better aircraft, not because of more pilots, because one man refused to accept that the rules could not be changed. Wade was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Then a second. Then the Distinguished Service Order. By the time he left the Mediterranean in January 1944, he had 23 confirmed kills. He had never lost a wingman. He had trained over 400 pilots personally. The maneuver that bore his name had saved hundreds of lives. But the story does not end there. What happened to Lance Wade after the Mediterranean? What price did he pay for his innovations? And why is his name almost unknown today, while pilots around the world still use techniques he invented? The answers are waiting in Part 4. They involve a transfer to a new squadron, a new aircraft, a routine training flight on a January morning, and a tragedy that would erase one of the greatest tactical minds of the Second World War from history. The man who had cheated death 100 times over enemy territory would not survive a peacetime takeoff in Italy, and the full scope of what he accomplished would be buried with him. Until now. A small-town Texan with bad eyesight and no connections invented a maneuver that the entire military establishment said was suicide. He proved them wrong in combat. He convinced skeptical commanders with mathematics and results. He trained over 400 pilots personally. He reduced Allied fighter losses in the Mediterranean by 26%. He turned the P-40 Warhawk from a flying coffin into a weapon that made the Luftwaffe hesitate. By January 1944, Lance Wade was one of the most successful fighter pilots in the European theater. 23 confirmed kills, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Distinguished Service Order, command of his own tactical development unit. The maneuver that bore his name was saving lives every single day. But this story has one final chapter, a chapter that almost no one knows, a chapter that explains why the name Lance Wade is not taught in flight schools, why his photograph does not hang in aviation museums, why the man who changed aerial combat forever disappeared from history within months of his greatest triumph. Because success sometimes comes with a price that no one sees coming. January 12, 1944. Foggia Airfield, Italy. The morning was cold. Gray clouds hung low over the runway. Lance Wade had been transferred to the 145th Squadron 3 weeks earlier. New unit. New aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt was everything the P-40 was not. Faster, more powerful, better climbing. It did not need Wade's defensive maneuver because it could outperform almost anything the Germans put in the air. Wade's role had changed. He was no longer the desperate innovator fighting against doctrine. He was an established expert, a respected voice. His job was to evaluate new tactics and train the next generation of fighter leaders. It should have been safer. The dangerous days were behind him. 200 combat missions over North Africa and Sicily. Dozens of engagements where a single mistake would have killed him. He had survived all of it. On this particular morning, Wade was scheduled for a routine training flight. Engine familiarization. Nothing complicated. He had flown the P-47 a dozen times already. The aircraft was ready. The weather was acceptable. There was no reason to expect anything unusual. Wade taxied to the runway at 0847 hours. He received clearance. He advanced the throttle. The Thunderbolt began its takeoff roll. Witnesses later reported that everything appeared normal for the first 800 feet. Then, without warning, the aircraft veered sharply to the left. Wade tried to correct. The P-47 lifted off the ground at an abnormal angle. It climbed to approximately 50 feet. Then, the nose dropped. The aircraft struck the ground at the edge of the runway. There was no fire. The impact was not survivable. Lance Carroll Wade was killed instantly. He was 28 years old. The investigation took 3 weeks. The conclusion was engine failure during a critical phase of flight. A mechanical defect. Random. Unavoidable. The kind of accident that kills pilots in peacetime as easily as in war. There was no enemy. No combat. No heroic last stand. Just a cold morning and a machine that stopped working at the worst possible moment. The man who had cheated death 100 times over enemy territory did not survive a training flight in Italy. The news reached Wade's former squadrons within days. Pilots who had learned his maneuver. Pilots whose lives he had saved. They held informal memorials. They raised glasses in mess tents. They told stories about the quiet Texan who had changed everything. But the war did not stop. It could not stop. Within weeks, new pilots arrived to replace the old. The veterans who remembered Wade were transferred, killed, or rotated home. By the summer of 1944, there were entire squadrons using Wade's turn who had never heard his name. The maneuver had become doctrine. Doctrine does not have a face. It does not have a story. It simply exists. Wade's notebooks filled with calculations and diagrams that had revolutionized fighter tactics were packed into a crate with his personal effects and shipped to his family in Texas. His father received them 6 months later. He could not understand the mathematics. He stored them in an attic where they remained for 40 years. The official records listed Wade as one of 4 537 Allied pilots killed in the Mediterranean theater. A number among numbers. His tactical innovations were credited to the institutions that had initially opposed them. His name appeared in a handful of unit histories and then faded into silence. But his legacy did not die with him. It just stopped belonging to him. The defensive brake that Wade invented did not disappear after World War II. It evolved. When jet aircraft replaced propeller fighters in the 1950s, test pilots discovered that the same principles applied. Energy management, turning radius, forcing overshoots. The physics remained constant even as the speeds tripled. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabre pilots facing MiG-15s used variations of Wade's maneuver. The official training manuals called it the high-G defensive brake. No mention of Wade. No acknowledgement of origin. Just technique stripped of history. In Vietnam, the problem returned with new urgency. American F-4 Phantoms were designed for missile combat. They were heavy. They turned poorly. Against nimble North Vietnamese MiG-21s in close-range dogfights, they were at a severe disadvantage. The solution came from studying World War II tactics. Energy management, vertical maneuvering, forcing overshoots through precise timing and maximum G-loads. The Navy established its fighter weapons school in 1969. You know it better as Top Gun. The curriculum included maneuvers that Wade would have recognized immediately. The instructors did not know his name. They taught the physics. They taught the timing. They taught survival through superior technique rather than superior equipment. Today, every fighter pilot in the world learns some version of what Lance Wade discovered in a tent in North Africa in 1943. The F-22 Raptor can execute defensive brakes at speeds Wade could not have imagined. The principles are identical. Trust the mathematics. Sacrifice speed to tighten radius. Force the overshoot. Reverse the geometry. Modern flight simulators allow pilots to practice these techniques without risk. Wade had no simulator. He had to prove his theory against actual enemy aircraft firing actual bullets. One chance. Get it right or die. Military historians estimate that Wade's innovations, directly and through the tactics they influenced, saved between 800 and 1,200 Allied lives during World War II alone. When you include the pilots trained in subsequent wars using derived techniques, the number grows into the thousands. Tens of thousands. Pilots flying today, who have never heard the name Lance Wade, owe their survival skills to calculations he made by candlelight in a North African desert. That is a legacy that transcends memory. It is encoded in doctrine, embedded in training, invisible but permanent. But the true lesson of Wade's story is not about aerodynamics. Wade's experience reveals something uncomfortable about how institutions handle innovation. The military that rejected his ideas was not stupid. It was not malicious. It was doing exactly what large organizations do. It was protecting proven methods against unproven alternatives. It was valuing consistency over experimentation. It was managing risk in the way that risk is always managed, by avoiding change. The problem is that sometimes change is not optional. Sometimes the old methods are failing so badly that continuing them is the greater risk. Wade saw this. His commanders did not, or they did and could not admit it. The distance between a radical idea and accepted doctrine is not measured in logic. It is measured in authority, in relationships, in the willingness of powerful people to admit they might be wrong. Wade had none of these advantages. He had mathematics and desperation. He succeeded because he found one person, James Stockwell, willing to listen, and because Stockwell found another person, Keith Park, willing to act. That chain of trust, fragile and improbable, was the only thing that separated Wade's innovation from 100 other good ideas that died in silence. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Billy Mitchell proved that aircraft could sink battleships in 1921. The Navy court-martialed him. It took Pearl Harbor to vindicate his theories. Hugh Dowding developed the integrated air defense system that saved Britain in 1940. He was forced into retirement months after the Battle of Britain ended. John Boyd revolutionized fighter tactics and aircraft design in the 1960s and 1970s. The Pentagon treated him as a nuisance until they could no longer ignore his results. Wade belongs in this company. A man who saw what others missed, who proved what others denied, who paid the price that visionaries always pay. The difference is that Mitchell, Dowding, and Boyd lived long enough to see their ideas triumph. Wade did not. He died at 28, 3 months after his greatest success, before the full impact of his work became visible. History remembers the survivors. It forgets those who fall too soon. There is one detail about Lance Wade that almost no one knows. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Elizabeth Thornton was researching tactical innovations of World War II. She found references to Wade in scattered unit histories. She tracked down his family in Texas. Wade's nephew, then 74 years old, still had the crate of personal effects that had been shipped from Italy in 1944. Inside were Wade's notebooks. Thornton was the first qualified person to examine them in 60 years. What she found changed the historical record. Wade had not just developed the defensive brake. He had documented an entire system of energy-based air combat theory. His notes anticipated concepts that would not be formally articulated until John Boyd's energy maneuverability theory in the 1960s. 20 years before Boyd working alone in a tent without institutional support, Wade had derived many of the same principles. Boyd became famous. His theories transformed aircraft design and pilot training worldwide. He is considered one of the greatest military strategists of the 20th century. Wade is a footnote, but the mathematics are the same. Thornton published her findings in 2007. The response was minimal. Academic journals, a few enthusiast websites, no major recognition, no posthumous medals, no renamed training facilities. Wade remains unknown because he died too soon, because his notes sat in an attic for 40 years, because history had already assigned credit elsewhere. But here is what matters. The ideas survived. They saved lives. They continue to save lives today. Wade would not have cared about recognition. He cared about results. His notebooks prove that. Page after page of calculations, diagrams refined over months. The methodical work of a man trying to solve a problem that was killing his friends. He was not seeking glory. He was seeking survival. For himself, for the pilots he flew with, for the ones who would come after. In that, he succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. From a small-town pilot with bad eyesight and a notebook full of calculations to a tactical revolution that changed aerial combat forever. Lance Wade proved that innovation does not require permission. That being right matters more than being believed. That one person thinking clearly under impossible pressure can find answers that entire institutions miss. Because of him, hundreds of pilots came home who would otherwise have died over the Mediterranean in 1943. Because of the techniques he pioneered, thousands more survived Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts around the world. Because of principles he derived alone in a tent. Fighter pilots today fly with knowledge that began as desperate calculations by a man who had 4 seconds to live. Wade never saw the full impact of his work. He died 3 months after his greatest triumph, killed by a mechanical failure on a routine training flight. He was 28 years old. His grave is in a military cemetery in Italy. Few visitors stop. There is no statue, no plaque, no monument to what he accomplished. But every time a fighter pilot executes a defensive brake and survives an attack that should have killed them, Lance Wade is there. In the mathematics, in the timing, in the principle that sometimes the only way to survive is to do exactly what everyone says is impossible. That is his legacy. Not fame, not recognition, just lives saved by ideas that refuse to die. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovator whose ideas changed history, share it in the comments. History is full of people who saw what others missed and paid the price for being right too soon. Subscribe to discover more of their stories. Because the past is not just what we remember, it is what we have forgotten. And sometimes the forgotten stories matter most of all.